All right, here we go. So let's talk about Hasatan's war against the man-child, okay? Because what we did in the last teaching is we saw that Genesis 3:15 through 16 was a prophecy not just about Yeshua and his victory over the devil on the cross, but that it also had further implications. And it's actually what's happening is actually about our victory as the body of Messiah over him in the book of Revelation, specifically the overcomers, the overcomers. So let's look at that, because remember, the main promise for the man-child in Revelation 12 was that they would rule with a rod of iron. And so the first thing that we saw was that there are other people other than Yeshua who are promised to rule with a rod of iron. And then we were able to connect that to those who overcome. But, I mentioned that even though it does seem like it appears to Yeshua, we went through, in the teaching before, we went through and we showed why it couldn't be Yeshua. Yet at the same time, there is something about it that makes it seem like it is Yeshua. And so we're going to talk about that right now, okay? So Revelation, we've learned that the man-child of Revelation 12 is not Yeshua, okay? It's not him. The man-child is composed of the overcomers, or the overcomers, believers who overcome in all things, okay? That's who it's actually referring to. We did that a number of different ways, but Yeshua does seem a good choice, okay? So now most people, again, assume that imagery in Revelation chapter 12, most people assume that that's talking about Yeshua, okay? And so what we want to do is we want to say that there's actually another story in the Bible that is, I think, a much better match for Revelation 12. So let's go ahead and read that first so that we have that in our mind. So let's read that because it's pretty profound. Revelation chapter 12, it says, "Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars." And we talked about how that is the nation of Israel. "Then, being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth." Okay? So she's about to give birth to this man-child. And at this time, John says, "I saw another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven and drew them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days. And then it goes on and describes the war in heaven. And then in verse 13, "Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the man-child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time, times, and a half time from the presence of the serpent. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon spewed out of his mouth." And then this verse that I love so much, Revelation 12:17. "And the dragon was enraged with the woman and went to make war with the rest of her offspring." That's not the part that I like. But this last part right here, where he defines who the rest of her offspring are, it says, "Those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Yeshua Messiah." Wow. And have the testimony. Keep the commandments and have the testimony, right? And that's what Adonai has called us to do. Okay, so there's actually another story in the Bible. So again, we talked about, let me see, okay, yeah, so we talked about the major themes. We talked about the woman, the warfare, the man-child, her flight into the wilderness. So let's look at a couple of themes here. Note the following themes from Revelation chapter 12. Theme number 1. It says that she bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. Okay? So I want us to concentrate on that. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. So we're expecting a ruler. Is the point. We're expecting someone who is going to rule and reign in some kind of way, okay? So the birth of a male child destined to rule with a rod of iron. That's what I want us to concentrate on. So let's think about that. And we're gonna continue and see what else we can find here. Here's theme number 2 that we're gathering from this story. And his tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. Okay? So as soon as this child is born, Hasatan is there. He's on the spot. And so the enemy is trying to destroy the man-child at his birth. Okay? So that's the second major theme that I want us to think about. Okay? Trying to destroy the man-child at his birth. Theme number 3, she bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. Okay? Now, what I want to do is, we've already talked about this and applied this to the overcomers, but what I want to look at here, where it says her child was caught up to God and his throne, does everyone see that it is the catching up of the man-child to the throne of God that is protecting him from the devil? In other words, the devil is right there waiting to devour the child as soon as it's born. I mean, he's ready to pounce. And it says that her child was caught up to God into his throne. And we talked about that word caught up, harpazo, right? It means to take violently, right? It means to snatch, okay? And so it's the snatching of that child that preserves its life. That's the reason why the child was snatched. So what I want you to do here is I want you to, because again, as I said, this is going to, what we're seeing here is that these scriptures, they apply on more than one level, right? So with where I'm going with this, I want you to think of, as far as this passage is concerned here, that Adonai saves the man-child from the enemy's evil designs. That's what I want you to think about, okay? Because that's what that snatching up is. The snatching up is Adonai saving that child from the enemy's evil designs, okay? So, and the reason why I'm saying that is I don't want, because where we're going right now has nothing to do with the rapture. And so I don't want you thinking about rapture right now, even though, caught up, but I don't want you thinking about rapture. What I want you thinking about, so that Adonai can bring this together for you, is that the child being caught up is basically the child being delivered, okay, out of the hands of the enemy, okay? All right, how about Revelation 12:10? Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now salvation and strength in the kingdom of our God and the power of his Messiah have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. Okay? So that's the other theme I want us to think about. The enemy being cast down. Okay? The enemy being cast down. Theme number 5. Revelation 12:6, the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days, okay? So theme number 5 is the woman fleeing into the wilderness where Adonai preserves her on eagle's wings, okay? So we saw earlier how, none of this can apply to Mary, the mother of Yeshua. It can't apply to her. None of this happened. Now, she fled to Egypt, right? But as far as going into the wilderness, being preserved. And then we also talked about how This right here, the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her 60 days. That's the 3.5 years in the tribulation. Okay, that's 3.5 years right there. So to say that, the woman is Mary and that happened 2,000 years ago, but this is telling us that the catching up the man-child is what triggered the 3.5 years. So that's why it doesn't apply to Mary, okay? So how about theme number 6? So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. Okay? And so again, what we see here is the serpent is using water in an attempt to destroy the woman. Okay? He's using water to try to destroy the woman. And then theme 7, Revelation 12:16, but the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon had spewed out. So Adonai supernaturally protects the woman from the water. That's the theme that I want you to see there. So that's quite a bit that we've come up with. So who are the best 2 candidates for the woman and the man-child? Well, we already know that we've talked about who the woman is. The woman is the nation of Israel. Okay. Now, as far as the man-child, we're going to throw you some curveballs, okay? Because we've already shown that it's not Yeshua. We've shown that it's the overcomers. But when we look at this, as I said, this story here, it does seem like it has some connections to Yeshua, obviously, because when Yeshua was born, there was an attempt on his life, okay? But what I want to suggest to you is that the man-child could also be Moses. All right? Moses. Now, this is how I want to build this. We've already seen how Scripture has multiple levels of interpretation. Okay. Now in Revelation 12:5, I spent all the last day or so providing evidence that it's not Yeshua. I've provided evidence that it's not Mary. I've provided evidence that the woman is the nation of Israel. And I've provided evidence that the man-child is the overcomers. And I'm not changing that at all, okay? But what I want to do is I want to show you something here, because remember the title of this slide was Hasatan's Warfare Against the Man-Child. And what I want to show you here is that what's happening in the book of Revelation with Hasatan trying to destroy this man-child is not anything new. Okay? And the other thing that I want to show you is that Satan has done this before. And the reason why it seems like it's Yeshua is because Satan is always trying to destroy the man-child that Adonai is trying to bring forth. Okay? And so what I want to suggest to you is the idea of a man-child is something that has been in the Bible before. And it has to do with someone who's destined to rule and to reign. And see, Moses was destined to rule and to reign in Israel. Am I right? And so in other words, Hasatan, he understood the plan. He understood what was going on. He understood Genesis 3:15 through 16. And so that's why he was always getting to work, so that he could kind of foil things and mess things up, right? We already talked about how he tried to use the angels cohabiting with women to corrupt the seed, the genetic makeup of mankind, so that Yeshua wouldn't be able to be our deliverer, because he would not have identified with us in every way. And that's why you have the giants and et cetera, et cetera. Okay? When Abraham, when he arrives in the land, guess what it says? In Genesis 12, it says, and the Canaanite was in the land. Right? Just kind of out of nowhere. It just says, and the Canaanite was in the land. And then it just kind of leaves and goes on with the story of Abraham, okay? And the reason why is because there was another outbreak of these angels cohabiting with men, and that's where we get the giants like Og, and where we get Goliath and things of that nature. But here's the point. The point is that Satan is always working behind the scenes to try to thwart Adonai's plans. So what I want to suggest to you is that when it was time, let's go back to the covenant between the pieces, Genesis 15. In the covenant between the pieces, Adonai told Abraham straight up, it's going to be 400 years, right? Now, do you know Satan knew that? He knew that. He was there. He was listening, right? So Satan knew the time period. He knew that it was going to be 400 years, and then that's when God was going to make his move. So he made sure that he was jolly on the spot. So when that time period came, that just happens to be when the children of Israel were proliferating, right? They were multiplying and multiplying and multiplying, and that's when it took Pharaoh's notice, right? And Pharaoh says, "Hey, you know what? We need to kill these male babies because they are going to, they're going to join our enemies and try to get away, try to make war with us." So what I want to suggest to you is that Pharaoh didn't just come up with that idea on his own. Okay? Hasatan knew that it was time for that nation to be born, and he knew that there was going to be a leader. And so what he did is he worked through Pharaoh. He worked through Pharaoh to make the edict to throw all the male children to drown them in the Nile River, because he knew that there was time for a deliverer to be born. It's the same thing with Jacob. When Jacob got into the land, when he made it back to the land, and remember I told you how the Shechemites came and said, "Hey, you take our daughters, we'll take your daughters, and then, everything will be hunky-dory," right? And we showed you how that's the doctrine of Balaam, right? That's what happened when the children of Israel were on the plains of Moab, ready to go into the land, and the Midianites sent their women and the Moabite women over to cohabit with the children of Israel. And if Adonai hadn't delivered them from that, the plan of salvation is off, because you don't have a nation of Israel anymore. And you don't have a temple for Messiah to come to where all righteousness needed to be fulfilled, like all those sacrifices he needed to offer, that Mary needed to offer, et cetera, et cetera. Yeshua had to fulfill all righteousness. And so Satan is constantly, throughout the Tanakh and the New Testament, he's constantly trying to get in there and gum up the works, okay? So that little story about how Shechem raped Dinah, and then the men of Shechem, they come and they say, "Hey, why don't you give your daughters to us, and we'll give your daughters, and we'll give our daughters to you." That was a satanically inspired plot. And it's called the doctrine of Balaam. Now, I know it doesn't call it the doctrine of Balaam until it's with the children of Israel and on the plains of Moab, but we showed you today how Jacob's life is a prophetic picture of the children of Israel. Everything that Jacob did happened to the children of Israel. And right in Jacob's life, when they meet the Shechemites and they come up with this idea, we'll trade daughters. That's right when the children of Israel are on the plains of Moab. Okay? So what I want to suggest to you is that Moses is a good candidate for a man-child, because he's going to rule in Israel. All right? So let's look at an even better fulfillment of Revelation 12. So this is, again, the overcomers are the man-child in Revelation 12. But what I want to do is I want to show you that the whole idea of Adonai bringing forth a man-child and Satan on the scene to destroy the man-child is not new to the book of Revelation. All right, so theme number one, she bore a male child who's to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God. And remember I told you that the way I want you to think of this is the birth of the man-child. This is about the birth of the man-child destined to rule with a rod of iron. And a man of the house of Levi went and took a wife, a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. So here we have the birth of a man-child. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. She knew there was something special about him. And so she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And so she called his name Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." Okay? So in other words, here is the birth of the man who's going to lead the nation. He's going to become the greatest leader that the nation of Israel has ever had, Moses, the lawgiver. And so he is, as it were, a man-child because he's going to rule and reign in Israel with a rod of iron. Revelation 12:4, his tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. So what happens, that's what happens in Revelation chapter 12. What I want to suggest to you is that it's happened before, and it happened with Moses. The enemy tried to destroy the man-child Moses at his birth as soon as he was born. Because what do we read in Exodus 1:15 through 16? The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other was Puah. And he said, when you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, then she shall live. That's the enemy trying to destroy Moses before he was even born. Pharaoh didn't just come up with this idea out of the blue because the children of Israel were proliferating and multiplying. Now I know that's what the storyline appears as. But again, Hasatan knew that it was time for Adonai to come and deliver that nation from Egyptian bondage. And he knew that he was going to have a deliverer, a man-child. And so he is there trying to thwart that, okay, by destroying the male child at his birth. Revelation 12:5, she bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God in his throne. And remember I said, I just want you to think of this as that's how Adonai saves the child. Okay, because that's what happened with Moses. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. That's why Moses was able to survive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? But when she could no longer hide them, and then another verse, this is chapter 2, verses 3 through 4, Moses' mother, when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. Okay? So this is the salvation of that man-child. Okay? Even though the devil was there waiting to destroy him, he was saved nonetheless. Okay? Revelation 12:10. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now the salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Messiah have come. The accuser of our brethren has been cast down. He has been cast down. Okay, and what I want you to think about, and actually I should have put this one a little later, but anyway, it's here. All right. So what I want you to think about is Pharaoh and his chariots and his army. Remember when at the splitting of the Red Sea? Remember, it says that when they were finally defeated, when Pharaoh and his army were finally defeated, he was cast down into the sea. His chosen captains also drowned in the Red Sea. The depths have covered them. They sank to the bottom like a stone. In other words, what I want to bring out to you is that in Revelation chapter 12, it talks about how Satan in his defeat will be cast down, and the same thing happened in the splitting of the Red Sea with the children of Israel. How about this one? Then the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So we're talking about the woman fleeing into the wilderness where Adonai preserves her on eagle's wings. What happened with the children of Israel when they left Egypt? Where did they go? They went to the wilderness. Exodus 14:3 through 4 and Exodus 19:4. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they are bewildered by the land. The wilderness has closed them in. Then I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them, and I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, that the Egyptians may know. Remember we talked about this? That the Egyptians may know, because God was introducing himself to them, that I am Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. And then chapter 19, verse 4, look at the wording here. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Okay? So in other words, what I'm showing you here is that everything that's happening in Revelation chapter 12 with this man-child has happened before with the nation of Israel in a symbolic way. And so we're just showing you the connections. So some of these connections that we're showing you to Moses and Israel, they're not exactly the same as what you read here. And the reason why is because the prophecy in Revelation chapter 12 is not specifically about Moses, it's about the overcomers. But the whole point is that this has happened before. Adonai has had more than one man-child. Moses was one, and Yeshua was one. That's why this story in Revelation 12, it seems like Yeshua. But it's not Yeshua. It's those overcomers. But this has happened before, okay? It's happened before. So let's look at another one. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, right? Now, Moses is born, right? Satan tries to get him destroyed as soon as he's born by having him drowned in the Nile River, right? Now, the woman is Israel, right? So in Revelation 12, it says the serpent tries to use water, spew water out of his mouth to destroy the woman. Let's read Exodus 14, 10 through 11. And when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us to die in this wilderness? Why have you dealt with us? So in other words, what's happening here is, how is the enemy trying to destroy the woman Israel who brought forth Moses, the man-child? He's trying to use water, the Nile River. He was going to drown them. He was going to drive them into the Nile River. Into the Red Sea. Into the Red Sea. So see, this is exactly what we read in Revelation chapter 12, that after the woman brought forth the man-child, that the dragon persecuted her and chased her into the wilderness and spewed out water to destroy her. And that's exactly what we read in the Exodus account. Revelation 12:16, but the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood. In other words, we have a supernatural deliverance of the woman from the water that was spewed from Hasatan's mouth, and we read of the same thing in typology in Exodus 14:21-23. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and Adonai caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into the dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. And so Adonai, what he does is he supernaturally delivers the man-child, the nation of Israel, from that water. Okay, the fate of every man-child. So let's look at this. Let's bring this all together. The man-child Moses and the birth of the nation of Israel are one of the best fulfillments of Revelation 12, or prefigurings or shadowings, okay, that we can see. So you can see a lot of that with that right there. So, and actually, I can see how, once you bring out all these connections between the man-child Moses, right, and Israel, you can see how there are more connections between Revelation chapter 12 and the story of Moses and his birth and the birth of the nation of Israel in Exodus 14 than there are to Yeshua, okay? Because in Yeshua's birth, it is true that Satan tried to destroy him, but it was months later after he was born. It was months later. It wasn't like right there, as it says in Revelation chapter 12, he stood before the woman as she was about to give birth to devour her child. It was months later. That's why Herod had the children in Bethlehem and the surrounding areas 2 years old and under murdered, okay? So with Moses, it was right at his birth, because they were throwing male babies into the water. As soon as he was born, that was supposed to have been his fate. And then we also see the picture of Israel going into the wilderness. We also see the picture of the enemy trying to use water to destroy Israel, the woman. We see Adonai supernaturally, parting the waves so that the water doesn't drown the woman. So there are way more connections to Moses and the children of Israel at the splitting of the Red Sea in Revelation chapter 12. Okay? So what's going on? What's going on? Now that we see the connections to Moses and the birth of the nation of Israel, Yeshua comes in a distant second place for the man-child, right? But again, the man-child is the overcomer. So what are we trying to do here? Okay? What is Adonai trying to teach us? The answer lies, again, in Genesis 3:15-16, the oracle of destiny. Genesis 3:15-16, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Hasatan knows that the seed of the woman is destined to crush his head. Okay? He knows that from that prophecy right there. He understands what that prophecy means. He also knows that the seed of the woman who will crush his head is also destined to rule with a rod of iron. Okay? He knows both of those things. He knows both of those things. Therefore, excuse me, therefore, whenever Hasatan is threatened with the birth of a man-child who's destined to rule with a rod of iron, his number one goal and priority is to kill it. Okay? That's his number one goal, is to kill it. Right? So he is following this plan of salvation also. He understands Genesis 3:15-16, and he understands that it has more than just one fulfillment. Okay? We talked about how, yes, Yeshua is the seed of the woman of Genesis 3:15-16. I feel sorry for some of you who are just now getting here because we covered a lot of stuff here. But yes, Yeshua is, he is that seed, but it has multiple fulfillments. Okay? So whenever Hasatan is threatened, whenever there's a man-child, if he's going to be ruling with a rod of iron, his number one priority is to kill it. We got to kill this thing. We need to stop this right now before things get out of hand, right? Hasatan tried to kill Moses at birth because he knew it was time for a man-child to come forth to rule with a rod of iron in the nation of Israel. He knew that. Hasatan tried to kill Yeshua at birth because he knew Yeshua was going to rule with a rod of iron. He knew that Yeshua was a man-child. He was God's man. And Hasatan will try to destroy the end times man-child at his birth because he also, the overcomers, who are what Revelation 12 is literally about, those people who are overcomers, he is destined because he knows that they're destined, as we said, the scripture says that they will literally sit on the throne with Yeshua. Yeshua said that. Remember, we looked at that verse and we thought about how profound that is. As a matter of fact, it's so profound, I want to look at it again. Let's turn over to Revelation chapter 3. So we're going to look at two promises. Let's look at chapter 2, verse 26-27. It says, and he who overcomes and keeps my works until the end, to him I will give power over the nations. He shall rule them with a rod of iron. They shall be dashed to pieces like the potter's vessels. See, we always think that that's just Messiah. No, he just said this is going to happen for those who overcome. Whoever overcomes of my people, he said, they're going to rule with a rod of iron. And then chapter 3, verse 20, look at what it says, verse 21. To him who overcomes, I will grant to sit with me on my throne as I also overcame. So Yeshua said there's a group of people that will literally sit on the throne of the King of Kings who's going to be ruling and reigning the entire universe. That they're going to sit on his throne. Now, beloved, that's not everybody. That's not all of us, right? I mean, It's not everybody. It's a select group of people. I have no idea who they are, right? It's a select group of people. Adonai knows. He knows. He knows who they are, all of them. He knows who they are. But Hasatan is going to try to destroy him. But those people, that's who Hasatan is trying to destroy. So we can see that. We've seen Moses and the children of Israel. We've seen how the Satan tried to destroy him at birth. He tried to destroy Yeshua right after he was born, and now he's up to the same thing again. So now we can understand how Revelation 12:5 does have those subtle connections to Yeshua, although many of the particulars are a little different, right? They're a little different, right? Because again, as we said, when Yeshua was born, and we won't go through all that, but the whole idea is that in Revelation chapter 12, those events kick off the Great Tribulation. They kick off the 1,260 days, and none of that happened at Yeshua's birth. So this is the end of this teaching right here. So we're gonna end a little early on this one. We've got a couple more later on. But what I want to do is, so this is the official end here.